I've been interested in mecha anime and manga and visual novels and video games and probably other forms of media I've forgotten for a while now. Arguably, since I was a kid watching the first 3 episodes of the Metabots slash Metayacht dub on loop off a DVD I randomly had. Or maybe since I was a young teen that watched Evangelion because some anime YouTuber mentioned that a show they recommended referenced it a lot. That eventually led me to watch my first Gundam after Netflix recommended me Unicorn randomly. Or, the way I personally see it, since 2019, when me and my sister decided to sit down together and watch Mobile Suit Gundam Iron-Blooded Orphans together after watching a bit of the origin on Toonami because it came on after Lupin the Third. That was the point where I really dug into the genre as a whole. Me and my sister went through most of UC together, and I decided to watch a lot of the AU stuff on my own. Picking up Super Robot Wars V on a whim eventually introduced me to Getter Yoba and Mazinger, and eventually got me to actually interact with other mecha fans, through later thinking my Super Robot Wars Z save was glitched or something. But one part of mecha history I've always been slacking on looking into is the really early days. I watched a good few 70s shows, your Voltez's and Tomino's pre-Gundam marks, stuff like that. But before I started this project, the earliest I ever went was the first half of Raiden. I'd read the original Mazinger manga, but even that is only from 1972, which, while very early, is still not that early in the grand scheme of things. To both force myself to go back and to give myself a cool running series for this cool epic YouTube channel you should subscribe to, I decided to go through and talk about the evolution of the genre as a whole, starting with, as the title of this video says, the stuff that came out before 1972, nearly started the genre. Of course, I won't be able to talk about everything. I don't speak or read Japanese, or have enough money to pay translators, so I'm stuck with stuff that is translated and obtainable for me. But expect that to hopefully become less of a problem after this part, because old manga really is not that well documented on the English internet. And, well, let's get to that old manga, because that's what most of this is. I could find neither the original Tetsujin anime or manga fully translated, but I went out of my way to at least read what is translated of the manga. I could find the first 5 chapters, which were either retconned or just featured a fake Tetsujin, as he looked like this. 2 volumes of the Black Ox arc, which is mainly centered around a very small stretch of ocean, around a random yacht, and the many, many trips to that yacht. And the Superhuman Kelly arc, which is a deep, tragic look at how far people will go to try and advance science, what lengths someone will be forced to go through due to being isolated from society, but still having to survive, and the unbreakable bonds of family. In this manga, that feels so very of its time. In its simplicity, this story stands as a story that feels like it must have inspired so many others through its pure pathos. Also, the opening to this anime is sponsored by the company Glyco, its name being shouted out right alongside the opening describing the pure power of Tetsujin. I found this kind of interesting, because you still see stuff like this today. Think Aquarion Logos, half being a Shirobako advert. That was a funny bit, right? I get super into talking about that one arc, then I cut to a funny anecdote. I'm looking at my cat while doing this section. Am I gonna cut this? I probably will cut this. The elephant in the room currently is probably that I have not talked about the actual mecha elements of this manga at all. Design-wise, it's very obvious why, even if people haven't watched any Tetsujin arcs or read this manga, Black Ox and Tetsujin itself are full iconic designs that people would tell at a glance. Some of the other designs, like that original Tetsujin and the main enemy in the Kelly arc, are not so striking and iconic. The thing about Tetsujin, and all mecha before Mazinger, you've probably heard, is that Mazinger invented the piloted mech, while Tetsujin invented the mech itself. While this might seem like a pretty meaningless change, it really is felt in this manga. In stuff like Mazinger and most works after it, the mecha showing up is the start of the conflict. Like, there might be a little chase where Koji's on his motorbike or whatever, but the real action doesn't start until it's two mechs punching each other. While in Tetsujin, the main conflict is that chase, people trying to kill Shoryo, and then Tetsujin showing up is the climax of it. They'll be threatened. We ask, what if Shoryo dies before Tetsujin gets here? Then Tetsujin gets there, and there's a bit of a punch-up, but it's much less of a threat. Even if there is a big mecha action scene, during those even, the main question is still, what if something happens to Shoryo? Maybe he's already injured going into it, and he might faint and not be able to control Tetsujin, or whatever. I would assume this is part of why the mecha main character got a lot older from Mazinger on. When it's a piloted mech, the age of the character doesn't really matter for the action. A 10-year-old mecha pilot and a 30-year-old mecha pilot don't really change the fights. There's stuff you can do with it, of course, but on a base level, both are in the same amount of danger. While if the main danger is towards the pilot, it makes a lot more sense for it to be a younger protagonist. I wish I could talk more about Tetsujin, because what was there was pretty interesting. I feel like without the full scope of the arc, I can't really say much that wouldn't be talking about, like, the 2004 version, which I don't know how close that is to the original, or just talking about what I assume Tetsujin is. So I guess I'll have to end this one here and go on to talk about stuff that is actually fully translated. I only read the Ambassador Magma manga for this video because I both couldn't find the Tokusho subbed, even though I know it has been subbed, and also just because the other Tokusho I watched for this video did not give me that much confidence. It's a very interesting walk in this early history of mecha to me, because it both has pretty obvious ties to later mecha stuff, especially like Brave series walks with the whole normal child meets space alien robot and fights evil premise. It even has the same structure as Gao-Ga-Ga, where it ends its story, then it just randomly decides to continue that story with a crossover that adds some neat stuff, feels very tacked on. But it also has a very different feel to it than Mecha. A lot of the action is human action, and the stuff with the Yakutonians, which is what the titular Magma's race is called, is either disconnected from it, the final payoff to it, or very rarely is the setup for the danger. A lot of the story feels a lot more sci-fi, switching between like sci-fi horror and sci-fi fantasy. A lot of the pseudo-people stuff is very Invasion of the Body Snatchers. The time travel stuff feels very classical sci-fi adventure novel. Them basically having the Big Bang as a god figure feels very much like you would find in a pulp novel. The cosmic stuff in this manga is honestly really interesting, and I wish it was expanded on more. Earth, the dude who created Earth, being like a weirdo who feels the need to own a planet, and this guy being called out by God, despite him also basically being God in the story before Chaos, the Big Bang God, shows up, is interesting to me in a way. The entire Earth ownership trial was pretty good, even if it is really short. Like, it's just a cool concept to have these two weirdo god figures beefing over being the god of a specific planet. It's the level of dumb beef I would expect gods to have, despite it not mattering at all. The second half of this, as mentioned earlier, is a crossover, at least I think it is. Black Galan, I think, is Devil Galan, or Gan, which I think was a previous Tezuka work? I don't know. I couldn't find it translated, so I don't know the full context. But knowing what little context I do know does make that being the ending of the manga even more confusing. One of the most interesting, but also confusing parts of this manga for me is the character of Yuki. She's like this random girl that is introduced, and who doesn't really matter to the overall story, who the main character and his dad got into. And there's two of her, and they don't know which one is the pseudo person. The pseudo people, they're body snatchers, but they're like clone body snatchers. The people don't die or whatever. They meet her, and they're instantly like, we have to kill the bad one. But they're both like, nah, she's chill, why would we kill her? But then one of the Yukis, we don't know which one, like yats the dad and the kid out to the bad body snatchers. But they never say which one did it. I guess we're meant to assume it was the duplicate, the clone. But also, they were friends. Maybe it was the real one. It's this weird, short section that's never really expanded on. And it's like, it just ends with them killing the duplicate anyways. And it's like, we don't know if she did anything. But she dies. And it's like, this is such a weird addition of moral grayness to the story that just is not lingered on. Like, I have to wonder if something happened behind the scenes to cause it to feel this disjointed. Another aspect I want to talk about is the main character. Mamoru is the pretty average protagonist for the time. Just like normal kid, McNormal kid. His dad's a journalist, his mom stays at home. That's just like his thing. And I think it's kind of interesting how he's like this very normal protagonist for the time. But also, he's kind of not, in that he's usually not there when the robots are doing stuff, when the Yakutonians are there. His plot is mainly with Pick, his like robot duplicate that's made in his image. And it's usually like sneaking around, dealing with pseudo people, and dealing with the big bad guy on his own. It's like, this is interesting to me, that like, Shotoyo and Daisaku are characters who control their robots, but they're still people who have to be there. Like, they aren't in the robot, but they're still important for the robot. While Mamoru doesn't have to be there at all. He's much closer to like a Brave series protagonist, or the girl from Brigadoon, where the hero and the main character are completely separate entities. At most, Mamoru brings magma to places by blow the whistle. But that's not really super important. His main thing he does in the first arc is spread mushrooms around, because mushrooms kill pseudo people, and cause a bunch of children that the main villain likes to rebel against them. And it's like, this is cool, I feel. I like it. It makes him feel a lot more active, that he's fully unrelated. What I know of Black Galan with Pick, who is like a little baby in Galan, who makes Galan not angry, that's a lot more similar to like Shoto, where the human is a weakness for the mech. If the human gets destroyed, or killed, or knocked unconscious, or taken away, the mech cannot operate. While in this manga, it's much more that the mech and the human walk in parallel. And I find that really interesting. I think that's cool. I think something like that should be done more even now. Giant Yobo is a weird franchise. The manga and Tokusho were similar conceptually, but overall very different works, releasing at basically the same time. Later you would get the OVA, The Day the World Stood Still. That's probably the most famous work in the franchise, despite not really being that similar to either of its sources. Then there's GR Giant Yobo, part of the 2000s esoteric mecha reboot trend, that seems to be mainly known for not being its pilot episode that was closer to the manga. But talk of the franchise as a whole is for later. For now, it's the manga at the center of discussion. I think on some level you could maybe describe this as the first real Yobot work. Its plot structure is much closer to something like Mobile Suit Gundam than anything else I've discussed so far. The older MC dragged into a war against an evil military organization is much closer to what one would call real than works like Mazinger. I really love how strong the opening of this is, instantly throwing us into the spy drama that makes up a lot of the manga before introducing us to Daisaku. And I love this version of Daisaku, getting mistaken identitied into this whole political situation because he's good at fighting and doesn't want to take a picture is almost comical if it wasn't also a legitimately interesting mystery on if he is or isn't connected to this whole thing. And once you know that he isn't, it's also interesting to like see this plot unfold still. A strange coincidence, or maybe intentional homage. Both this and Tetsujin have a storyline about having to deal with attackers while the cast is stuck on a boat. Tetsujin with the Black Ox arc, and Giant Yobo with the whole Journey to Japan that takes up a lot of the manga. Both even feature a pure black enemy mech, notable for its unique head shape. I assume this was in both, either because, you know, Island Nation with a famous navy, or Yokoyama just likes boats. But I found the connection interesting enough to note. Something I find interesting about Giant Yobo is that this is the first of these mecha things I've gone through that focuses on nuclear energy as a concept. GR1 is nuclear powered, GR3 attacks a nuclear plant. The final story is about Big Fire capturing a nuke. Nuclear energy, nuclear bombs, and obvious analogs of both are very widespread in mecha media. This is at least an early example of that, even if it might not be the first. This retrospective is intended to be only about mecha anime and manga, and also some other stuff that will come up because I feel like it's notable. And while in later years, Toku stuff still is very mecha, from Mecha Godzilla to Sentai Mechs to Ultraman playing soccer with the F-91, I feel like mecha's early existence is even more inseparable from tokusatsu arcs. Two of the things we've talked about so far were tied into concurrently running tokusatsu shows, Giant Yobo and Ambassador Magma, so don't expect this in any follow-ups really, but for now it's time to talk about some Toku. You might be thinking something along the lines of, why are you talking about this? And the answer to that is stupider than you can ever imagine. While doing some research, I stumbled upon the English language website for the 2007 anime GR Giant Yobo. On that site, there's a small history section that shows a simple timeline of mecha as a genre. On that page, alongside Talos from Greek mythology and the Gundam, was mentioned this movie. And in my opinion, if GR Giant Yobo considers this a notable thing in the evolution of mecha, so do I. This is a pretty classical story. The ruler of a place gets overthrown by power-hungry people, the ruler's children escape, and years later they return to overthrow the overthrowers. Think Wano, but instead of Luffy, it's a giant demon god in a stone statue. And it's an hour 30 instead of 50 hours. Watching it, I could definitely see why it could be seen as a notable part of the early mecha genre. Stone statues coming alive is a common trope in mecha stuff. Think Yaidin or Tane. It touches on the neutrality of power, which is like the main mecha theme. Daimajin is both described as a protector god and a war god that had to be sealed away. It attacks the warmongers and the civilians. It's a god and a devil. Thinking of this as like an early form of stuff like Yearth, God Mazinger, Yaidin, or Yazefon, with mecha aesthetically, but not in universe, really kind of makes talking about this make more sense. This is just that if it also didn't really look like a mech. This is also the first thing we've talked about with a female MC, which is cool. You could really argue that this doesn't have much of an MC, as it changes its main focus like 3 times. But I would say the old ruler's daughter is the most main of them all. She's the main character at the end, at least. I watched both of the sequels as well, but I don't really think they add a whole bunch to this specific conversation. Your Turn was pretty good, I liked the winter imagery, but it's less interesting than the first in my opinion, only really being notable as another kids get saved by big guy thing alongside something like Ambassador Magma. Yeah, this is just the first one, but less interesting. I cannot describe it in any way other than that. I don't really have much to say on this other than the fact that it's not great. Its most notable aspect for our discussion of mecha as a genre is probably that it introduced the child version of Daisaku that people know from the OVA, which also isn't great, but that's not here or now. The physical craft of the show is fine. The monsters are well designed, and the costumes are well constructed, at least from my untrained eye. But other than that, I don't think I have much positive to say. Characters aren't much, and the individual episodes are very, very formulaic in a way that is very unenjoyable, especially combined with the pretty slow pacing of the individual episodes. You could probably easily edit some of this into analog horror stuff. It has that vibe sometimes with like the hand episode, the eyeball episode. That could be funny. Maybe watch this show if you want to make that. Also, the Iron Giant just takes its ending from this, so if you're a big fan of the Iron Giant and want to know what it was inspired by, this is a good place to look. If you have general mecha knowledge or have scrolled very far down the Annie List Browse page, you'll probably feel like I've skipped over some semi-notable stuff. I watched the Flying Ghost Ship for this, most famously known from the Annie List Browse page where you look up mecha. But I don't feel like it's super notable for this discussion. It's much closer to a genre mashup than a mecha work, despite having a notable giant robot in it. Stuff like Astro Boy and Cyborg 009, while arguable and definitely important historically, I also feel fall just outside the category of mecha for me to include. Astro is a dude, not a mech. The same way like Mega Man or Darth Vader are, and I'm not going to be talking about Mega Man. For the historical importance angle, it's definitely more arguable that I should have brought them up, but I feel like then I'd also have to bring up stuff like Star Wars, which is also very important to mecha as a genre, even though I personally would not say Star Wars is mecha itself. Genre lines are very arbitrary, and I will have to draw that line multiple times throughout the series. And I just personally felt like stuff like this would be a bit too far over that line. Tezuka got his word in on the genre with Ambassador Magma, and his name will definitely come up again, even if I ignore all later Astro Boy stuff. Ishido Mori's stuff will be touched on a bit next episode, when we cover what might just be the most important year in mecha history, 1972, with a focus on one very expected work, and one other you might expect a bit less.